Carl Jung once wrote about a kind of person who could not live easily in the ordinary world, not because they were ill, but because they saw too much. He discovered this not in theory, but in the presence of a patient who walked into his life during one of his own darkest years, 1913, when he was separating from Freud and falling into what he later called his confrontation with the unconscious. The patient was highly introverted, deeply intuitive, and almost unsettling to be around. When she entered a room, she seemed to know instantly what no one else could see. She knew who was secretly bitter, who carried shame, who lied with a smile. She described people's inner lives with a clarity so sharp it left Jung astonished. He tested her observations carefully, questioning and cross-checking. Again and again, her strange perception proved right. She wasn't guessing. She wasn't delusional. She was seeing something real. Yet this gift, if it could be called that, made her life unbearable. She couldn't enjoy small talk because every false smile was transparent. She couldn't keep friendships because people felt stripped bare in her presence. She couldn't hold work because her very awareness disrupted the fragile, unspoken agreements that allow groups to function. Her life was a cycle of isolation, exhaustion, and failed attempts at belonging. Jung realized he was not treating a disorder at all. He was observing what happens when the unconscious is pushed too far into consciousness, when a person's intuition is so highly developed that it becomes almost unbearable. It was, he thought, as if she were a mirror no one wanted to look into, because she reflected back the parts of themselves they wished to keep hidden. In his private notes, Jung wrote that her perception was not only extraordinary, but dangerous. Dangerous not because she was unstable, but because the world around her could not tolerate her vision.
He later connected her experiences to what he would call participation mystique, the strange phenomenon in which some people are so open to the unconscious of others that they absorb it, live it, almost drown in it. The more Jung studied her, the more he understood the cost of such perception. To see through everyone's masks is to live without the comfort of illusions. To sense hidden pain and lies is to carry the weight of truths no one else acknowledges. And so, these people are left standing at the edge of human society, too awake to fit in, too perceptive to be at peace. Jung came to believe that this kind of perception could take a person down two paths. It could destroy them, leaving them cut off, burned out, and broken by truths no one else would share. Or, if they could find a way to master it, it could transform them, turning their suffering into wisdom, their isolation into a rare kind of strength. It was, in his words, one of the most dangerous discoveries of his career, because it showed him that sometimes the greatest burden is not madness but vision itself. Carl Jung noticed that some people live as if they are tuned to a different frequency, picking up signals the rest of the world does not hear. They walk into a room and immediately sense everything unspoken. They notice the tremor in someone's voice that betrays fear, the forced brightness in a smile that hides despair, the collective mood everyone else is unconsciously sharing but refusing to name. For most people, life is a theater where the masks are convincing. For these rare individuals, the masks are transparent. Modern psychology calls some of them highly sensitive persons, and studies suggest they make up about 1 in 5 people. But Jung's attention settled on something far rarer, a type he placed within his psychological typology, the introverted intuitive, perhaps only 1% of the population. The ability to live as a bridge between the unconscious and the conscious, simply by being. The woman from 1913 became just such a bridge. What once threatened to crush her became her way of serving others. She stopped treating her perception as a private torment and began offering it as wisdom. Her story, Jung believed, showed the deepest truth: the gift itself is never the danger. The danger lies in not learning how to live with it consciously. Jung's most dangerous discovery was not that some people see everything, it was that most who see everything never learn to carry it well. Yet those who do become pioneers of consciousness. They sense what humanity is not yet ready to face, and in doing so, they prepare the way for transformation. If you have felt cursed by how much you see, you are not broken. You may simply be ahead of your time. Your vision is not a burden once you learn to hold it with wisdom. The world does not need you to suffer in silence, it needs you to learn how to embody what you perceive. When you do, your perception becomes not your prison, but your medicine, for yourself, for others, and for the future waiting to unfold. Eventually, she found work as a counselor. People who once recoiled from her intensity now sought her out, drawn to the clarity she could offer. She built relationships with those who valued honesty over masks. And most importantly, she made peace with her gift. Jung wrote that she had not learned to see less, but to see more wisely. Her perception was intact, but she no longer drowned in it. She carried it consciously. She became an example of what Jung feared and hoped for at the same time, that some people are born with a consciousness greater than what the world is ready to receive. Such a gift can destroy a person through isolation and overwhelm, or transform them into precisely what humanity needs to evolve. But Jung warned that this path is filled with dangers. Some fall into inflation, believing they are prophets with absolute truth. They preach, judge, and become possessed by the very forces they think they've mastered. Others withdraw, claiming the world is too unconscious to bother with, which Jung saw not as wisdom but defeat. Some become trapped in helping others, defining their worth entirely by being needed, while neglecting their own growth. And even those who find balance can regress when life throws its storms, losing their boundaries and becoming overwhelmed again. To walk this path, Jung said, required constant practices. Time alone, to separate one's own voice from the voices of others. Careful choice about when and with whom to share perception. Shadow work, so one's own darkness does not distort what is seen in others. Creative expression, to give form to the intensity within. And trusted companions who could keep one grounded in reality. At the highest stage, he said, a person with such perception no longer clings to it as identity or forces it onto others. They hold it lightly, seeing clearly without needing recognition, perceiving deeply without compulsion to fix everything. This is what Jung called the transcendent function. Their role was not to be applauded, but to be authentic, to see clearly and yet choose to love anyway. They no longer feared their gift, nor resented it. They carried it like a lantern, not to blind others with its light, but to quietly illuminate paths in the dark. They knew not everyone would understand, and that was no longer important. What mattered was staying true, holding their identity firm while remaining open to others, and offering their perception as service, not as weapon. And in that balance, they finally found peace. Not the fragile peace of ignorance, but the deeper peace of one who sees the world as it is, with all its shadows and hidden truths, and still chooses to walk forward with compassion. She sat across from Jung in 1913, quiet but restless, a woman carrying more than she could explain. While others moved through life blind to the hidden movements of the soul, she felt everything. She could sense lies without evidence, feel pain no one admitted, and detect the silent resentments people buried behind polite smiles. To her, every room was filled with invisible voices, and it exhausted her. Friends drifted away, uneasy under her gaze. Work collapsed because she disrupted unspoken agreements. She wondered if she was cursed. Jung, however, saw something different. He recognized that her suffering was not madness but perception, what he called differentiated intuition, a rare ability to notice unconscious truths. She wasn't broken, she was ahead of her time. The problem was that she hadn't yet learned to live with her gift. Instead of serving her, it consumed her. For 3 years she worked with Jung. Slowly, she learned to sort through the flood of impressions. She discovered which feelings belonged to her and which she had absorbed from others. She learned that not every perception needed to be spoken, and not every insight was hers to act upon. She began to see her vision not as a curse but as a tool that required discipline. The person learned, painfully, that wisdom loses its power when delivered with superiority. There were also days when the weight of their gift felt unbearable, and they longed to retreat from the world forever. They told themselves that others were too blind, too unconscious to be worth engaging. But Jung reminded them, withdrawal is not transcendence, it is defeat. To live fully meant staying engaged with life, no matter how imperfect others seemed. Another trap was becoming addicted to helping. At times, the person measured their worth only by how much they healed others. They forgot their own needs, pouring themselves out until nothing was left. It took years to learn that their identity was not their ability to fix people. Helping was a gift, but it was not the whole of who they were. And of course, there were moments of overwhelm, times of grief, stress, or loss when the old floods returned and they were once again saturated by the world's shadows. But by returning to solitude, by writing, painting, and finding the company of a few trusted souls who could truly see them, they found their balance again. Integration, they realized, was not a single victory but a lifelong practice. With time, something remarkable happened. Their perception, once a burden, began to transform into medicine. In conversations, their quiet questions helped others discover truths about themselves without feeling exposed. In groups, they gently named the hidden tensions that, once spoken aloud, lost their destructive power. They no longer tried to save the world. They simply offered their gift humbly, planting seeds of awareness wherever they went. Jung believed people like this were pioneers of consciousness, living a little ahead of their time. History, he noted, was filled with such individuals, lonely at first, misunderstood, but later recognized as the ones who prepared the way for collective growth. The person understood this now. Each evening, they sat in solitude, letting the noise of the day settle like dust in a quiet room. In time, they began to separate their own feelings from those they had absorbed. A certain heaviness in their chest, they realized, belonged to a coworker who had been hiding grief. The sudden anxiety in their stomach came from a friend struggling silently. And beneath all of it, they began to hear their own authentic voice again. It was faint at first, but with practice it grew clearer. Then came the shadow work. For years they had believed they saw other people's flaws so clearly because they were pure observers. But Jung taught that what disturbs us most in others often mirrors what we have not faced in ourselves. So the person turned inward and found, to their shock, fragments of selfishness, pride, and fear they had denied. Accepting these pieces did not corrupt them, it freed them. They no longer needed to sit in judgment. They understood that everyone was human, including themselves. With that acceptance, their vision softened. They still saw deeply, but now with compassion. As they grew stronger, they learned the art of conscious participation. They began to walk into rooms again, still aware of the undercurrents, but no longer drowning in them. They became like a vessel, able to hold someone's pain for a while without mistaking it for their own. They could listen to a friend's despair, reflect it back gently, and then release it instead of carrying it like a burden. Jung said this was the task of the individuated person, to serve as a bridge between conscious and unconscious, without losing oneself in the process. But the path was not without traps. There were moments when the person felt like a prophet, certain they had been chosen to reveal the truth others refused to see. In those moments, they preached, warned, and scolded, only to end up alone. Jung had named this danger inflation, when the ego mistakes the gift for divine authority. For Jung, this was the true meaning of individuation. Not just the discovery of the self, but the realization that the self, once integrated, becomes a force that changes the world. There was once a person who moved through the world as if their skin were thinner than everyone else's. They walked into a room and before anyone spoke, they already knew who was pretending, who was broken inside, who was angry beneath their polite smile. They could feel it in their bones, the weight of other people's unspoken truths pressing against them. To most, the world seemed simple, a smile was a smile, confidence meant strength, silence meant peace. But to this person, the smile was hiding sadness, the confidence was brittle, and silence was often filled with the noise of suppressed fear. At first, this strange gift felt almost magical. Friends would say, "How did you know I was upset?" or, "You always see right through me." The person thought perhaps they were meant to heal the world with this vision, to be a lantern in the dark. But soon they discovered the danger that Jung had warned of. Most people did not want their masks removed. When they quietly pointed out that someone seemed troubled, they were told, "Stop being so negative." When they gently observed a tension in the air, they were accused of creating drama. The world, it seemed, punished those who saw too clearly. So they began to wonder if perhaps something was wrong with them. They withdrew, feeling the weight of truths they could not unsee. Jung had seen this before in his patients and called it superior perception. He said it was both a gift and a curse, for it revealed what others could not bear to face. He understood that this ability could either destroy a person or transform them, depending on whether they learned how to integrate it. The first lesson was recognition. The person had to learn to ask themselves, "Is this sadness mine? Or have I picked it up from someone else?" Or deflect with denial. Or do they pause, consider, and respond with curiosity? Those who reacted with openness proved capable of holding more, and so, slowly, more could be shared. The key was always to offer insights as gifts, never as blunt declarations. The purpose was not to overwhelm but to invite understanding, to see if the other could walk with you into deeper truths without shutting the door. For Jung, all of this was not just about the survival of the sensitive few. He believed that those who integrated their heightened perception carried something vital for humanity itself. They became what he called culture carriers, individuals who helped consciousness evolve. He wrote that the individual has always been the bearer of the living spirit, the one who brings transformation into the world. These were not people apart from society, but the ones who carried its future. The path to this transformation unfolded in stages. At first came recognition, the moment when a person admitted to themselves what they truly were, no longer trying to suppress or deny their gift. This recognition was often painful, but it was also the beginning of wisdom. Then came integration, the challenge of remaining authentic without withdrawing into isolation. Here, the perceptive individual learned to balance truth with connection, to stay present in the world rather than retreat from it. The next stage was service. What once felt like a heavy burden began to shift into something else, a gift to be shared. The ability to see deeply no longer isolated them, it gave them the power to help others see themselves more clearly. And finally, there was transformation. At this point, perception was no longer just a private ability or a personal struggle, it became part of something larger, part of the unfolding of human consciousness itself. The one who once felt destroyed by their sensitivity became a kind of torchbearer, someone who carried light into the places where others could not see. But he also understood that no one can achieve this in isolation. He noticed that when such people met someone who had also gone through the deep journey of individuation, there was an immediate recognition. It was like two mirrors facing each other, each reflecting authenticity that could not be faked. They didn't need long explanations, the connection was instant, intense, and undeniable. It felt like meeting someone from a hidden tribe, the conscious minority, those rare few who carried their true selves without disguise. In such encounters, the burden of seeing too much lifted, because here was someone who would not flinch under the weight of truth. But he also found that people who were still in the process of transformation, those engaged in therapy, inner work, or spiritual practices, could often hold space for the perceptive individual. They may not have the same rare ability, but they valued it because they were already learning to face their own truths. These were the ones who didn't panic when confronted with uncomfortable insights. Instead, they asked questions. They leaned in. They were not afraid to be known because they had begun to know themselves. Then there were the natural containers. These people didn't necessarily have unusual perception or spiritual insight, but they carried a strength born of life's trials. Loss, hardship, and grief had shaped them into vessels that could hold the emotions of others without breaking. For the perceptive soul, these people were sanctuaries. Around them, it became possible to rest, to let go of the constant effort of carrying too much. They didn't need to see everything, what mattered was that they could bear what was shared without judgment or fear. Still, Jung advised caution. To reveal too much too quickly was dangerous. He taught what he called gradual revelation. It began with something small, a gentle observation about what you notice in another. Then came the test: do they recoil, grow defensive? For Jung, Nietzsche was a tragic example of what happens when superior perception devours its bearer. But there were other examples, ones that gave hope. Meister Eckhart, the medieval mystic, also had extraordinary sight. He perceived spiritual depths that few could comprehend, yet he did not let it overwhelm him. Instead, he transformed his perception into wisdom, shaping it into words that guided others without shattering them. His gift became a source of nourishment, not destruction. Jung believed that Eckhart succeeded because of his humility. He treated his vision not as a weapon or proof of superiority, but as a responsibility to serve others gently. Jung himself knew this struggle intimately. Between 1913 and 1919, he entered what he called his confrontation with the unconscious. Waves of visions and inner voices nearly drowned him. At times, he feared he was slipping into madness. But instead of running, he studied what was happening. He drew, he wrote, he explored his own depths in what became the Red Book. Slowly, he realized that his terrifying visions were not signs of illness but signs of evolution, consciousness stretching beyond its familiar boundaries. This discovery saved him, and it changed the way he treated those with the same gift. He came to believe that those with extraordinary perception faced a stark choice. Their gift could destroy them, leaving them isolated and consumed, or it could transform them into something extraordinary, able to guide others. The difference, he told his patients, lay in integration. And perhaps the most important lesson he learned was that no one could carry such perception entirely alone. You must find, he would say, the few who understand. For only with such rare companions could they discover that their gift was not a curse but a light meant not to blind the world, but to guide it. Jung once said that the greatest privilege of a lifetime is to become who you truly are. Jung often told them that what irritated or disturbed them most in others was usually a reflection of something unacknowledged within themselves. Those who saw deception everywhere often struggled to admit their own ability to deceive. Those who raged against selfishness were often blind to the same streak in their own nature. He reminded them gently that every human being carried the same possibilities, both light and dark. Accepting this did not mean excusing cruelty or dishonesty, but it meant understanding that nothing they saw in others was foreign to the human heart. The more they integrated their own shadow, the less haunted they became by the shadows of those around them. Only then could they look at others without judgment and without being poisoned by irritation. The final step was the hardest, learning to participate in the unconscious world of others without losing themselves in it. Jung called this conscious participation. Those who reached this stage could listen to another person's fears, pain, or hidden struggles without drowning in them. They built inner containers, strong enough to hold the weight of someone else's emotions for a time, while never confusing them with their own. These people became bridges, able to bring hidden truths into the open, not through force, but through compassion. Yet Jung knew not everyone succeeded. He often warned of what happened when this gift went unintegrated. He pointed to the story of Friedrich Nietzsche, a man of extraordinary perception who saw through the illusions of his age with piercing clarity. Nietzsche could strip away the falsehoods of religion, morality, and culture with devastating precision. But he never learned how to balance what he saw. Instead of turning his vision into healing, he turned it into a weapon. His insights isolated him from others, consumed his spirit, and ultimately drove him into collapse. The blurring of self until nothing remained but a vessel filled with everyone else's unclaimed shadows. It was not only exile they risked but annihilation, the erasure of the self in service of carrying what others refused to see. For Jung, this made integration not a luxury but an urgent necessity. To see so much without the strength to carry it was destructive, but to see and integrate, to hold these truths without dissolving into them, could lead to extraordinary transformation. It was a narrow path, destruction on one side, awakening on the other. Those who walked it would either collapse under the weight of what they carried or rise into something few human beings ever become. There were people Jung met who seemed born with a vision too sharp for ordinary life. They walked into a room and felt everything, the tension in a marriage, the sadness behind a smile, the bitterness hidden in polite words. They carried it like a second skin, absorbing what no one else dared notice. But what seemed like a gift quickly became unbearable. They grew exhausted, confused, even lost, not because they were ill but because they couldn't tell where they ended and the world began. Jung knew these people didn't need medicine. They needed a path to live with their perception without being destroyed by it. He would begin by teaching them to recognize what was theirs and what was not. Many of them had spent years carrying the grief of a parent, the anger of a partner, or the fear of a stranger as if these feelings belonged to them. He urged them to pause and ask, is this truly mine? Or am I carrying someone else's burden? To make this possible, he advised them to spend time alone each day, in silence, away from the noise of other people's emotions. In that solitude, the storm of borrowed feelings would begin to settle, and their own true voice would slowly rise above the rest. But recognition was only the beginning. The next challenge was facing the shadow. And rarest of all were those who perceived everything but had no framework to manage it. For them, life was a flood of impressions. They drowned daily in intuitions, in fragments of images, in the silent cries of others, in shadows no one else would acknowledge. Their burden was not just knowing but being unable to shape what they knew into something coherent. They lived in perpetual overwhelm, their vision a torrent they could not contain. Jung saw the cost each of these types carried, and he began to understand why their gift was so dangerous. Families, groups, and societies hold themselves together through silent agreements, collective illusions that keep everything stable. We agree not to mention certain truths, not to confront certain lies, not to tear the masks away. These individuals, simply by seeing too clearly, shattered those agreements. They destabilized groups without speaking, just by being unable to pretend. Their existence itself was a kind of disruption. Even more painful was the isolation. Jung called it the problem of the superior function, the curse of having a strength so rare it becomes a source of exile. These people often felt as though they were living in another world altogether, an island of awareness in an ocean of unconsciousness. They longed for connection but found that most around them could not understand what they saw. The loneliness was not simply social but existential, as if they inhabited a different layer of reality than everyone else. The most terrifying danger, however, was when their boundaries dissolved completely. By absorbing so much of the unconscious life of others, they risked losing themselves. Their own identity thinned until it was hard to know what belonged to them and what had been absorbed from the environment. Jung called this state participation mystique, the merging of the individual with the collective unconscious. He began to notice that this extraordinary perception did not take a single shape but manifested in distinct patterns. Some lived as though their nerves had no barrier at all. They did not simply notice another person's sadness, they felt it in their own chest, as though their body had been hijacked by someone else's grief. In moments of joy they glowed, but it was rarely their own joy. Their emotions were a chorus of voices that did not belong to them, making it nearly impossible to know where their feelings ended and others began. Jung described them as living in a state of emotional contagion, perpetually carrying what those around them refused to feel. Others were gripped by a different kind of clarity. They saw patterns unfolding long before anyone else recognized them. A friend would enter a relationship, and before the first fight they already sensed the break that lay ahead. A colleague would pursue a career path, and they knew, without conscious reasoning, that collapse was waiting months or years down the line. They could not explain how they knew, it was not logic but a kind of unconscious mathematics that added itself up behind their eyes. To the outside world, their foresight seemed uncanny, even supernatural. To them, it was simply unbearable accuracy. Then there were those whose sensitivity took root in the body. They felt illness before the patient felt symptoms, exhaustion before the sufferer admitted it, tension in the muscles that betrayed unspoken sorrow. In their presence, the human body revealed secrets, and they became early warning systems no one asked for. They were the ones who would look at a friend and quietly say, "Something is wrong," only to be met with denial, until the illness, or the breakdown, arrived. The intuitive person entered, and before long, they became the target of collective tension. It was not because they were disruptive, but because their very presence disrupted the silent agreement to keep certain truths buried. Jung wrote that such people become the repository for what the group cannot admit. They carry the unlived lives, the suppressed emotions, the denied conflicts of those around them. The cost was profound. These individuals, often blessed with extraordinary awareness, found themselves alone. They struggled with friendships, because few wanted to feel so exposed. They struggled with work, because their clarity unsettled teams that relied on unspoken compromises. They carried a vision of life stripped of illusion, and the weight of it pushed them into isolation. Jung believed that this pattern revealed one of the deepest paradoxes of human psychology. The very function that can elevate a person to insight, wisdom, and transformation is also the function that threatens to exile them. To see too much is to be cut off. To see the unconscious too clearly is to risk becoming its victim. Yet for those who could survive this burden, for those who could learn to carry it without collapsing under its weight, Jung believed it could lead to something extraordinary. The mirror that others rejected could, in time, become a window into truths that humanity needs, even if it cannot always bear to look. Carl Jung became aware, slowly and almost reluctantly, that there were people who lived in a different kind of reality. They were not mad, not delusional, but burdened with a perception so refined that it brought them both clarity and suffering. These were the people who saw what others refused to see, who felt what others denied, who sensed truths hidden beneath the surface of every conversation and every gathering. For them, the world's masks were paper-thin, and behind them the unconscious pulsed and whispered. These are not simply emotional or empathetic, their minds are wired to perceive unconscious patterns that others cannot detect. Jung described their function as differentiated intuition, a sharpened instrument of perception that scans not just the surface but the hidden depths of the psyche. At first glance, it might appear to be a gift. Who would not want to see through lies, to understand others at a depth most people cannot? But Jung discovered that the very clarity of this vision was its own danger. The danger did not lie in what they perceived, but in what happened to them because of it. To see too clearly is to become a mirror, and when people glimpse their own hidden flaws in that mirror, they recoil. Few can tolerate the parts of themselves they work so hard to hide, and so instead of facing their reflection, they attack the one who shows it. Jung saw this dynamic repeatedly in his practice. An intuitive patient might gently observe, "You seem tired, something is troubling you." Rather than gratitude, the response would often be irritation or even anger. Another might point out a growing tension in a group, only to be accused of being dramatic or negative. They were not inventing problems, they were recognizing them. But those who could not face the truth needed somewhere to place the discomfort, and so they placed it on the one who saw. Jung called this process shadow projection. Every human being carries within them a shadow, the unacknowledged, denied, and repressed parts of the self. When another person's perception exposes that shadow, the unconscious mind must choose, accept the reflection and integrate it, or attack the mirror. Again and again, people chose attack. They turned the seer into the problem, making them the scapegoat for what was hidden in themselves. This was not limited to individuals. Jung saw it happen within families, workplaces, entire groups.